and I'm speaking again with Nitin Saran in India. Good morning. Good evening to you. Good afternoon. Good morning to me.
Good morning. Good morning, Addison. It's a pleasure to be back.
Thank you very much. It's interesting. Our monthly calls have almost become quarterly now with work, but that's fine. Here we are, catching up. So,
Absolutely.
what I would like to do is we can start off with probably Air India and Vistara.
Yes.
Hello? Nitin, what happened? Hello?
Addison, I don't know what's wrong. Just hold on.
Okay, let's try.
Let's
You're
restart,
back.
please.
You're back. So
I
let's.
am back.
Okay. So again, Air India and Vistara.
Yes. Exciting news as far as they go. The mergers is complete. The last date of Vistara as an entity was the 12th of November, um, which was a bit of a nostalgic day because all the aviation enthusiasts were trying to get their last flights in.
I saw yours too. I saw your social media.
Yes, yes. I ended up taking the last flight from my hometown to New Delhi and back, which was very nice. But I'm happy to also report that I have flown them a couple of times after they've become mainline Air India, and they're still fairly good. They're still fairly good.
That's excellent. So of course it's going to be an interesting cultural cocktail that has to come out of this.
Well, from a technical perspective, I know a lot of their pilots, and they're not used to having aircraft which have several things on the minimum equipment list. But now they have these older aircraft which they're flying, and they're not the swanky new Vistara metal. So it's been an interesting journey from the Vistara perspective. The Air India perspective, of course, is will also be a positive one. So let's hope both the cultures can learn from each other and find their own way.
Nitin, what you've just said though does speak to a very clear fear that few people are articulating. That the
Uh,
merger is going to sink to the Air India level, not rise to the Vistara level.
well, yes, I think that is always a risk. There's no doubt about that. But I think a lot has to do with how quickly they get new metal, how quickly they can refurbish their product. Because Air India's strengths have really been their crew. So let's hope that they can match that with you know decent product in the interim. Eventually, yes, they're
Right.
looking at a very good product. But I agree with you. It can still go either way.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that everybody would have to say or wish that everything gets better because, quite honestly, Air India never had a competitor like Indigo before. So it's better for them to take the Vistara lessons and apply that across the new company as best they can.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you bring up a very good point. We really have reached a point of a duopoly now in India. You have Indigo and Air India essentially. All the other players are just so minuscule that they're almost insignificant at the moment.
Now, you mentioned an interesting point there about new metal. Air India just did another blockbuster, excuse me, announcement for 100 new airplanes, which had been undisclosed before in Airbus's data.
Yes.
It's interesting. At the end of the last Paris Air Show, when Indigo put in that blockbuster order, everybody in our space was talking about this being outrageously big. And
Hmm.
then we did this little table looking at population by nation and airline fleets. And Air India, or the Indian economy, obviously not that many people are traveling as they are in other companies, but as the
Yeah.
economy matures, it looked like India was frighteningly short of airplanes. It seems that a lot of movement in the industry, certainly by Indigo with their non-stop taking of deliveries. Now Air India stepping up like this. There's a
Mhm.
realization that it's not just new metal, but any capacity.
Absolutely. I mean, the perfect example is Indigo, who has been, inducting either wet leases or it's been inducting older aircraft. And I think that has a large role to play in these large orders because, you have essentially two manufacturers. They can churn out aircraft at a certain rate, and you are essentially just securing your own future. And those, whether they're 500 aircraft, no one's looking at a 500 aircraft fleet in one go. People are planning for their
Sure.
older aircraft to retire and then get newer metal.
Well, the thing is,
But
of course, the deliveries are running so far behind schedule that everybody's holding on to older airplanes, and that's why you see things like, uh, you know, Akasa taking delivery of old Maxes. Now, what does that mean? They were first flown probably in 2019 or 2020, around the
Mhm.
time of the pandemic, but they were meant to go to China. They never did.
Right.
So, everybody's grabbing capacity where they can.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's the interesting conundrum that the world is in at the moment. The demand is much higher than the manufacturers can supply. And on while we're on that note, and I've said this a couple of times, and this is slightly off script, but we need place in this country to park those aircraft, and um, that's why purely looking at ordering huge amounts of aircraft is, in my opinion, slightly tunnel visioned. We have to be looking at larger airports, larger infrastructure. You see the Indian context at the moment when it's busy at some of our larger airports or even at some of our smaller airports. It is busy, and it's a bit scary considering that such a tiny part of our population actually flies, and it still can get so cloggy at certain times.
It's interesting you point that out, Nitin, because when we look, certainly this is the case here in the United States, there's no airport that you can go to, and I mean no commercial airport you can go to, and you don't see construction equipment.
Yes, yes, I
Every
witnessed that earlier. They say absolutely yes.
every airport in this country, as far as I'm aware, is a construction site.
Hmm.
But they're not adding runway capacity because they've been hemmed in. Cities have grown around these airports. And I
Hmm.
suspect that if the Indian government, which is probably the owner of all these airports, and even I'm not sure what the private ones, but if they don't expand the space around those airports now while they can, so
Hmm.
that there's growth space to
Right.
to handle this, they're going to run into terrible trouble.
I agree. I agree. And I think that, brings us to a very important point where, New Delhi and Mumbai both having backup airports. And I am very happy to see the progress that we've made in some of those. I recall, I'll be very candid in saying a couple of years ago, I was of the opinion who's going to fly to this, new Noida airport, which is coming up next to Delhi, and now it makes perfect sense. That's we are planning for the future.
It's interesting that planning for the future is a great way to come up with a vision on this, because if you think about it, this in commercial aviation is a long play.
Hmm.
The equipment is 20-year lifespan at least. But airport construction is a one-time choice. You get to
Correct.
make this choice once, and if you don't
Yes.
get it right, you run into a Heathrow, and
Absolutely.
you run into so many airports, LaGuardia. You run
Hmm.
into wherever you look, where there are these mega cities. The cities have grown around the airports. Nobody wants the noise. Nobody wants the pollution, whatever noise pollution, air pollution, whatever kind of. They don't want it.
Yes.
Oh, but they do want to go nonstop when they do decide to travel. This is a one-time event that the government in India has to get right. Grab
Yes.
space while you can.
I agree. And I think we have very important lessons to learn from the West. We have very important lessons to learn from Europe. We have very important lessons to learn from the United States, where we can see ourselves several decades down the road through your eyes and learn from the mistakes that were made, in so-called developed areas where you have to cater for not 30 years, not 50 years, but you're quite literally looking at 100, 150 years down the line.
Right. I mean, it's literally it's a one-time choice. You get it wrong once, it's going to create problems. And it's public policy is a blunt instrument.
Hmm. Yes. Yes, it is. And what scares me about the Indian context is the very typical Indian attitude of, oh, we will expand when the time is right or when it's needed. Because we've always had that very bureaucratic attitude. Let me take roads, for example. Highways will be widened only when they have the budget. They have the budget only when they, have the money. They have the money only when uh, it says that you need only X, but you're not planning for X plus 50. So it's a bit of a difficult one, but hopefully we are looking at it. This Noida airport, as we were discussing previously, they've just had the first Indigo aircraft land there, and which is, I'll be honest with you, I didn't even know that the runway was in such a condition that an aircraft could land there, let alone an A320. So that shows that the progress is being made, and let's fingers crossed that it's suitable and
Nitin,
adequate.
Nitin, how much more space is there at the end of that runway to make it longer?
I believe, again, I can't confirm this. This is only from satellite images I've seen, out of my own volition. I believe there is space. There is space.
Right, because if they cannot get to 12,000 feet, right away you know there's going to be a problem. And they need to have more than one, have to have space for more than one runway. Sooner or later, you're going to need another one, and then you're going to need another one. So this is
Yes,
why space is absolutely critical. While
correct.
we're on the subject of Indigo, that airline is starting to intrigue me because it looks like it's evolving from what it was at the start as it
Yes,
spreads its wings, so to speak, outside of the domestic market. Now they have to
correct.
have bigger airplanes. Now they have to have a different kind of seat. So you're changing the whole that business is evolving. What do you think is
Hmm.
going on there? Is it outgrown India? I mean, how could you outgrow the Indian market?
I think it's more decisions that are being taken on what they're seeing that the market wants. Um, but then again, those decisions are possibly the most difficult ones in aviation. Those are make or break decisions. And um, for a low cost airline, which I know very recently they've been trying to move slightly away from that image of being ultra low cost, but moving to more of a hybrid, um, version. I think it's very interesting. Will they be able to carve out their own sort of niche in the world and make a success of it? I don't know, but let's see. Let's see where they end up. But I know for a fact that investors and people with the money are, well, I wouldn't say in Indigo's case, but in general would be slightly nervous about someone changing their strategies so drastically. But purely from a financial point of view, though Indigo is the fairly good credit in the Indian skies at the moment.
Well, yeah, I would imagine they're very bankable. Um, but how much, for example, how long do they have to stay involved and engaged with Turkish 777s is it a wet lease or a dry lease?
A wet lease.
So how long does that have to continue before they get their own long range airplanes? And then where do they go? Which markets do they look for? It's the Turkish is going to want those airplanes back at some stage because they are also facing the same problem everybody else is facing.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
need capacity.
I agree. I agree. And those are the catch-22 questions and situations which will be answered. I mean, even Indigo ordering the A350, I mean, is a testament to them having got a very good deal on the A350. That's for certain. But what do they put it? What use do they put
Right,
it to, which will make them sustainable amounts of money?
right. The other thing that I found interesting was I don't know if you noticed this that Air India took an old ex-China 777-300ER out of the desert in Southern California to add to their fleet. So, there's again an example of just it appears like inelastic demand inside of the Indian economy for capacity.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's 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 on paper they have the capacity, uh, but some of their products are just so poor. This is Air India's example. That it's just, I agree, Addison. It's a very interesting point in the aviation journey that we are all at right now. People are out to grab whatever they can. I mean, let alone, grabbing aircraft from the desert. Imagine Indigo and Qatar and the wet leases with the 737 Maxes. I find those absolutely, um, you know, fantastically interesting. that
Right.
they and I often joke with a couple of my Qatar uh, pilot friends who left India to fly for, on the 777, etc. And I joke with them saying that it would be very ironic if you got your command and they put you on the 7-3 and you ended up flying for Indigo after all those years. So it's
Yeah, that
anything
would
is
be
possible.
the interesting thing about this. And again, this is something that I've not seen covered anywhere, but it certainly looks like India's aviation market is now outpacing China's in terms of growth.
Well, it's certainly we have the business to support it in the background. Um, and we have, yes, I think that is a fact.
It's just wonderful. I remember when we first started the series of conversations, um, we were going through COVID. Everybody was depressed. Everything was shrinking. We couldn't figure out where, we couldn't see the horizon. We knew there
Right.
was one, but we just couldn't see it. And now, oh boy, what a turnaround this is. 4 years
I wish
later.
I wish I had put more money in the stock market back then. It just shows you that I agree. I remember that call that we had where there were literally tears in all of our eyes, because it was such a frustrating time for us and our industry. And it just shows those are times to reconcile, to huddle up, and just get stronger for when the floodgates are let open.
So let's look back and look forward a little bit here. This will probably be our last item for the call. Looking back over the year, Nitin, what do you think are the highlights in the Indian commercial aviation sector?
Well, I think without a doubt, the highlight was, the Air India Vistara merger. Without a doubt, that was really the biggest deal out of the whole thing. Second would really be, Indigo and its new strategy with actually getting metal with so-called business class seats. Um, Without a doubt, those are the two biggest, um, you know, successes of the year, I would call them. One would talk about SpiceJet trying to get out of insolvency, but let's see. Well, not insolvency. I shouldn't be using that term, but SpiceJet getting out of their economic problems. But I personally don't see that changing very drastically for the remainder of the year. So that's something to see next year.
How about that star from nowhere called Akasa?
Well, Akasa is there's been a lot of discussion about Akasa because there's been a lot of chatter with the Indian government as far as the Cape Town Convention implementation goes. And the example that's been taken with the government is, people like Akasa are the ones who require that sort of regulation the most, because that gives comfort to lenders and to creditors, um, to come and lease their assets or provide financing. And I think that's, if they play their cards right, it's definitely, a huge market to be had. But then let's also not forget the Goairs and the Spice Jets, which our market has produced, and they
Right,
have to stay completely clear of any of the mistakes those airlines made.
right. If we look forward, it seems to me, it's funny your comment about the stock market. Um, it look if I you and I look forward now to the next year, it seems to me with all these airplanes coming in, particularly second-hand airplanes coming into the market, it would seem to me that anybody in the MRO business in India is going to make buckets of money.
Yes, yes. I think that's you bring up a very valid point, because the MROs in India have grown from, small players to fairly large players in a very short amount of time. And I've seen that dealing with trying to get go first aircraft out. They are very cutthroat. They're on top of the game. They know what they're doing. Um, that's one aspect. But I will also like to add that I think whatever happens in the United States, in the beginning of the new year, will have a big impact on whatever happens in the country, especially since a lot of our aviation aspects are governed by the US dollar. So Trump policies and decisions, how they fluctuate the price of oil, the US dollar versus the Indian rupee, will be a big determining factor on how well our industry does.
Although there was this announcement this morning about India striking this humongous oil supply deal with Russia. That should
Well, yes,
ameliorate a lot of stuff.
yes. I mean, that's been on and off for a while. There's no doubt that they are our biggest, um, allies or suppliers of oil, um, whichever way you call it. So it will be interesting. It will be interesting, even with President Trump's policies about tariffs, etc. Let's see where that ends up. So I think we are in for very interesting times.
It's one last thought on that issue. It seems to me that if we're going to go into a more aggressive tariff environment, which certainly seems we're going that way, now would be even perhaps a little bit late. But it would seem to me, for example, Boeing would be well served to have a FAL or some serious infrastructure in India to support its customers, but also to de-risk itself from US tariffs. And
Yes.
this is where Airbus is going into Tianjin, Canada, Mobile, Alabama. That was a very good move, looking
Hmm.
back, because they've
Yes.
just de-risked their business.
Correct. Correct. Well, let's see. And you see, with India being poised as, everyone's choice after China, I wouldn't say necessarily to counter China, but in the region, where we speak the language, we are extremely bureaucratic, but at least we are able to communicate. It's exciting times. If you ask me personally, from a business perspective, I'm quite excited to see what happens. 2025.
Well, hopefully 2025 we'll be doing our next call. So I wish you
Absolutely.
all the best for the holiday season.
Thank
And
you very much to you
uh,
and your family too.
thank you. And we'll talk soon.
Next year.